Welcome, everyone. Bienvenido a todos. This is the Nuestro South podcast, Loud and Proud. I am Axel Herrera. I'll be your host. This incredible series will explore the Poder y Cultura of Latinx folks in the South through perspectives of amazing scholars who have lived experiences and the research background on what it's like to be Latino, Latina, and Latinx in the South. Today, we are kicking off our conversation with Professor Perla Guerrero, who will be helping us start to unpack some of these themes of Poder y Cultura in the South. Perla Guerrero is an associate professor of American Studies and Latinx Studies. She's the author of Nuevo South, Latinos, Asians, and the Remaking of Place, and is working on a second book about deportation and coerced return to Mexico. So she's an incredibly knowledgeable scholar, and we're happy to have her today. And so that we start, we'd like to get to know a little bit more about you, and specifically just share a little bit of your personal history and relationship to the South, and how you came to study this place, to be in this place.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to share both my personal experience and my research trajectory. So I was born in Guanajuato, Mexico, and in 1985, my mom, my brother, and I joined my dad in Pico Rivera, California. My dad entered undocumented, and my family entered on a tourist visa, which we overstayed and thus became undocumented. And so my family is a beneficiary of amnesty, the 1986 IRCA reform, and we can talk a little bit about that later in the show. But in suburban California, I felt very much at home. It's a majority Mexican-American community. And then at the age of 16, at the age of 16, my family moved to Arkansas because a padrino called my dad, telling him that there were plenty of jobs in Polleras, and that it was a great place to move to and have some steady job. So yeah, I moved to Arkansas when I was 16.
Wow, that's an incredible story. I mean, I think one of the things that I would like to do in this episode is really kind of compare differences across like immigrant stories. So you mentioned coming here and then eventually becoming undocumented after a period of time. I came as an undocumented children, basically. I came with my parents, and that was in 2005. So the span of those years varies a lot, but I think the experiences in some sense about growing up as a young immigrant kid can be very familiar. So before kind of getting more into those stories, because I have so many questions, I wanted to do a little bit of a flash round of quick questions, rapid questions. What is the name of your favorite food spot in Arkansas when you lived there?
Oh, in Arkansas. You know what? It was a Chinese restaurant, and I don't know the name of it, but it was right. It was in Conway, in my college town. Delicious food. Love it.
So Chinese restaurant. Was it like a buffet, or was it just like?
It was like a little buffet spot. The food was really good. They had those like really thin noodles. It seemed, quote unquote, more authentic than like, Panda Express.
Yeah. Buffets are common, at least from where I've grown up. So I feel that. Okay. What's a word that you think? So 2 questions. You can pick either one. What's a word that Southern Latinos say that maybe other Latinos don't? Or do Southern Latinos have an accent? Or the Latinos in the South have a Southern accent?
Oh, hell yeah. Latinos in the South have a Southern accent. So we can talk more about that later, but it's something I noticed when I went back for my research to do on the book, that I heard this really intense Southern drawl, and I was expecting like a white or black person, and I turned around, it was this Latina, and I was like, what the hell? Because when I was growing up, we were kind of part of a newer wave, and so that accent wasn't as present.
Oh, that's hilarious. I've always asked myself if people hear that I have an accent. I'm not sure. I'm still in the South, so maybe but I do definitely recognize other people have family in New York who definitely have at least some of a difference. What were your friends like during high school? I guess that's when you were in Arkansas.
So I moved to Fort Smith, which was and the north side of town, which was a working class area. So my high school had white, black, Asian, and a growing Latinx community. So My experience was a little different because I was a little bit older than many of the Latinx people. And so, and I was also in the honors and AP classes. And so a lot of my peers ended up being white and Asian American, children of refugees from Vietnam or Laos. So my friend group were white people and Asian American people. And I didn't actually have a lot of classmates in those honors and AP classes who are African American. So, I mean, there's certainly issues of segregation there, but yeah, white and Asian.
But the community as a whole had a whole mix.
Yeah, the community as a whole had a mix, but of course, like many other places in the United States, there was also a lot of segregation, and so you wouldn't necessarily overlap with people unless you were taking, you know, some other courses like art. I had more Black peers, but then we didn't overlap in enough classes to like build a real friendship, you know, that those kinds of things.
Just last question. What were some of your, when you were in Arkansas, what were your family's like weekend activities? What were some of the things y'all did?
So, you know, the other thing that makes my family a little bit different is that it was just my parents, my brother and I who migrated. We didn't have a big extended family. So we've always been kind of just loners in that regard. So we would go a lot to like the mall. One of the things that I remember very vividly is that by then we didn't have a car. So we would either have to call a taxi.
This is in Arkansas.
This is in Arkansas. Oof. We didn't have a car. And this is Arkansas in the 90s, okay? Yeah. So like there is no public transportation. There were no buses, no shuttle, nothing. So it was call a taxi or walk to the mall. So
how long was the walk?
It was a couple miles, like parts uphill. So that's kind of what we did. It's like, and my family, somos muy cineros. We love to go to the movies. So we would, you know, at the mall, it's like go to the movies and then maybe grab like
some food.
Yeah, some food or whatever. Nice. Yeah.
Oh, I can sympathize with the no car stuff. Oh man, so many walks.
Exactly. Arkansas is also the first place I realized that sidewalks aren't mandated. I was like, how is it possible that where are the sidewalks?
Yeah, no.
So I would have to walk on the road sometimes.
No, I feel you. I spent high school a few years working at a gas station, and that was, well, there are some buses by where I was living before, but earlier when we were much younger, in like a more smaller town area that we lived in, I remember that we would go. my stepdad was making fun of this because he was telling my youngest sister that, you know, que hay cosas que no ha experimentado. There's things that she hasn't done. She's like, because we would have to bring the bags from the grocery. So, you know, I kind of, you know, spent a few good number of times bringing, you know, la leche and then like detergent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I feel that. Okay, that's awesome. Well, thank you for, you know, engaging in those and just answering some of those quick questions. So go into kind of the meat of what this conversation is really trying to introduce like, one, that Latinos exist, right? And also trace a little bit of the history of like how they got here, right? And we'll have more specific conversations about this, but we can speak about this very broadly. And I would love to start with something that you proposed in a piece that you wrote, that is this question of Chicano history and how that's relevant to Latinos now in the South. So could you start by first defining what Chicano history is, and then we'll follow up from there.
Of course. So in very basic terms, Chicano history or Chicanx history is Mexican American history. It's the history of Mexican descended people in the United States. But really, Chicano history is politicized. It means that you recognize that your community has contributed something to the United States, that there have been challenges, coalitions, triumphs, and that you understand that your community has been an integral member of the United States, as opposed to history being something that just happens to you. Yeah. You recognize the way in which like Mexican Americans and have contributed to the United States. And of course, we can expand that to Latinos, right? Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Hondureños, Salvadoreños. But Chicano history is about Mexican Americans in the United States.
And how does that how does that come to be of importance when you're looking at, the dynamics of Latinx people, immigrants in the South today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the interesting part about Chicano history is that it has largely been focused in the Southwest, right?
Okay.
If
Yeah.
we remember that Mexico lost about a third of its landmass in the Mexican-American War, so that becomes incorporated into the United States, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and further north, right? So that region, the Southwest, is really the kind of the place where Chicanx history is born through the incorporation of that landmass. If we fast forward to the 1990s, when there's this dynamic growth of Latinos and migration to the South, it becomes a question of, what happens to people who are born here, or people that might have migrated, at my age, if I had moved at the age of 5 directly to Arkansas, my Southern identity would have been like much stronger, right? So I'd have Southern identity, and I might be Chicana if there were other Chicanos to teach me about what Chicanx history is all about.
Yeah.
I think in the South there can be a little bit of a disconnect with Chicano history because it's not history that's often taught in schools. So oftentimes, at least I felt this way, and I hear this still, that Latinx people don't know where the history of the region, the history of Latinos in the South. And so we keep kind of reinventing the wheel in our little silos in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in Durham, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. Whereas Chicano history when you're taught that, then you can start to see how you're related across all these different places.
Yeah, no, and that's wonderful to hear, because I think that's essentially part of what we're trying to do here. I mean, I think what you're expressing is something that I myself have gone through, right? Coming in 2005, and then just being this young immigrant kid growing up. Just we ended up here because my mom. The truth is that we first ended up in New York, and then after 6-7 months, my mom was homesick. She was tired. She was frustrated by being in a place like New York City, that when she came to North Carolina to visit, we decided to just stay, right? And that was something that was, one, just spur of the moment decision, but it was also something that helped her feel liberating. And so here I am, 7 years old, end up in the South, and you kind of get placed in this location that is deeply complex, has a huge history, and it's been 15, almost 16 years, and I'm still barely starting to learn what some of these complexities are. So that's what Nuestro South project really is, right? And I think that's well put from what you're saying of how complicated and hard it is for some of these younger generations, partly because we feel so separated. Because I had never heard of, like, I have friends actually that I've met that are from Arkansas, but I had never heard of like some of this history of like people, Latinos, coming to Arkansas. So before I get into that, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in what you wrote that you don't identify with the word Chicana, right?
I do. So I do not identify as a Chicana for a couple reasons. So even though I came to the United States relatively young, at the age of 6, and I moved to a majority Mexican and Mexican American community, what I heard growing up in Pico Rivera, California, was that Chicanos were US born. So that idea that I, as an immigrant, could not be Chicana was ingrained in me at a very young age. Now I tell my students, you can totally be Chicano if you want to. It's not a birthright thing.
Yeah.
It's about culture and growing up. But the other reason I don't feel Chicana is because even though my community was Mexican American, the apartment buildings where my family lived was majority immigrantes de Latinoamérica, right? Peruanos, Salvadoreños, Panameños. And so I grew up in a very kind of immigrant community. And so, the kind of Chicano culture that is present in other parts of LA was absent from my own childhood. So I think Chicanx identity is really powerful. there can be some like other things. There can be some places where they gloss over important stuff, like the fact that as Mexican Americans, we also have African ancestry. There can be a fetishization of indigeneity, but that's something I think about when I was a scholar. You know, growing up, it was like, oh, it's really cool. Like you have lowriders. We would go watch them parade the lowriders down like Whittier Boulevard. But I didn't know anybody who had a lowrider, right? My dad like barely had a car in LA, so it was a bit of a disjuncture.
So how would I guess to keep on with this topic, how would a so I feel you. One of the kind of things that my stepdad's from Mexico. So my youngest sister is Hondureña, Mexicana, pues U.S. citizen, right? Trifecta. I think there's actually probably a lot more of those that I've encountered recently as well. So, but maybe it's not someone specifically like her that has that mix, but someone who grows up in kind of a more Mexican dominant family, for example, but in the South. What would it take for them to kind of identify with this kind of Chicano identity or history?
That's a really interesting question. I think part of it is learning the history. Like, do you identify in some way with, for example, the UFW, the United Farm Worker movement? Do you organize for labor rights? Do you recognize the, I think is it, I'm blanking on the court case, Mendes versus Westminster, I think is a very important case. So it's like, do you see yourself as part of that trajectory, as part of that movement? And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the movements of Latinx people in the South like do mirror those. But I hear more callbacks or parallels to the African American civil rights movement. And I think that really speaks to the importance of place, right?
Yes.
Like growing up in the South, what you really hear about is African American civil rights struggles.
Yes.
And less about Chicanx struggles. And so you might, and your friends might be all Black, right?
Yeah.
You might be the only Latinx person. And so you have, identities are about who you're surrounded by, who you learn from. And so it could be that in college, if you take a Latino studies or Chicano studies class, that you're like, oh, these are my people. I really do identify with them. Identity ebbs and flows. So I don't think there's like a magic formula of like, this is what you do to be Chicano.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great segue to, you mentioned this phrase, place makes race. And you also kind of mentioned the trajectory of how you were identified by different things, depending on what you were. Could you relate a little bit of what that was like and what place makes race means when thinking about this stuff about being in the South?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So like I said, I grew up in Pico Rivera, California, majority Mexican American, a Mexican immigrant. And so there and in LA, people knew I was Mexican, right? So, and because I am Mexican, it totally fit. Then I moved to Arkansas, and in Fort Smith, the first day of high school, somebody asked me, "What are you?" And I thought this girl was joking. And I was like, "Oh, why don't you guess?" And she was like,
oh no.
She was like Vietnamese, Laotian,
everything,
Eskimo, like Indian. And I was like, what? Because to me, again, having grown up in LA, I was like, obviously I'm Mexican. So moving to Arkansas was the first time I really encountered this idea that because I had moved 1,500 miles east, that my race had changed. And so what I realized after a couple of weeks or months of being in Arkansas is that the girl thought that I must be Asian, right? Her first two guesses were Vietnamese and Lao. That I must be Asian because that was the other non-Black, non-white community were Southeast Asians.
That was the like exception that existed.
Right. So it's like you're not white and you're not Black. So you must be this third other. So I saw the way that changed over time. Like by the time I got to college, I had a white friend tell me, "Oh, you're not a real Mexican like the other ones."
What does that mean?
I think it means that because I spoke English the way that I did, because I dressed the way that I did, I didn't fit the stereotype, the racialized ideas of who Mexicans were, right? And so I was like, oh, wow, okay. But also in that college town, people thought I was white initially for at least a couple years. And that really baffled me. It's like I could kind of maybe see Asian, like Vietnamese, but now you think I'm white and I'm very confused. But
Oof.
because in that college town at the time, there was the Asian American community was largely absent. They're like, well, I guess you're not Black, so you must be white. And so that's how I came to Place Makes Race, right? Because the way that people understand who we are is based on the context in which we live. So in LA, I was obviously Mexican, but in Arkansas in the 90s, I was another. I wasn't even Mexican. I wasn't Latina. That conception didn't really exist to mark me as Mexican or as Latina at that time.
So that's a roller coaster, right? That I think many people probably growing up in the South identify that to some extent, because I can think in other situations where, especially now, there's been a weird thing where I used to be the only Hondureño in school, right? And so obviously it would revolve more on like you speak Mexican, so like instead of speaking Spanish. But I moved from that small town where I was, which the Hispanics that existed were mainly Mexicanos, and then it was a weird realization for me to find others of my own, like I guess, national heritage as well, because we moved to Durham. And I was like, tantos Hondureños. I was like, what? Where they come from? So like that's been another dynamic that I've noticed, at least, like, you know, instead of others perceiving you, coming to realize that like, oh, there's others similar to me around.
You.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
did they think that you were too Mexican as an Hondureño?
Well, here's what I'll say. The ones I identified with, it was during the time that a lot of unaccompanied minors came. And so the space that I came to occupy was more of like an intermediary. The more interesting and honestly bad dynamic was that there was kind of like a rift between those who were US born versus those who were newcomers. And so initially, no one thought I was, you know, in terms of talking about race and skin tone and appearances. When I would come to a group and start speaking Spanish, they were like, whoa, you speak Spanish? So those were interesting dynamics, but I think mostly it was the issue of whether like I could actually interact with those who were Hondureños, newcomers, especially with language if they didn't speak English, but with others who were US born, it was just like, once they recognized like, oh yes, he does speak Spanish, then it was just like, we're normal, we're young, either immigrant or non-immigrant, but like just kind of the culture is the American culture is pretty much the dominant one that we were identifying with, and therefore there wasn't that much like difference.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that citizenship, right, becomes this big divide. I think in the Mexican American community, there's also that history of folks who are either US born or third, fourth generation Mexican American, perhaps relying a little bit, rechazando un poco, Mexican immigrants, right? Because it's like, there's a marginalization of immigrants as being folks who are taking over, who are quote unquote stealing jobs, who are they're cast in a negative light. And so, you know, it brings that tension forward. In Arkansas, something similar happened. And I was always baffled by that because I thought, you know, again, in the 90s, we're such a small community. How is it that now we're fighting about who's an immigrant and who's a US citizen, or who's a citizen and who has TPS? You know, these are not really like, this is not what solidarity is about, folks.
No. And I think I find that, you know, I'm blessed enough to have the opportunity to discuss and talk about these terms, but I think these are conversations that in some ways we need to democratize and just have more across the board. And I think to that point about Latinos in Arkansas, how did they come to end up in Arkansas? I had no clue prior to meeting a few friends from there. I had this friend a few summers ago that was from Little Rock, Arkansas. She was always repping it. But for at least where you came to end up at, or what you studied, how did Latinos end up there?
Yeah, so like many other places, Latinos ended up in Arkansas through their social network. So again, I mentioned my padrino called my dad, said there's work in polleras. We didn't know what that really was, something about chickens. And so because at this time in the 90s, there was a sharp economic downturn nationally, a lot of folks in California lost their jobs. My dad was among them. He struggled to find steady work for about 3 years. And so when my padrino called, he was like, yeah, I mean, there's work, it's a low cost of living, es tranquilo, is another kind of code word that people used. And so, yeah, people went because they had mobility, right? They can move from one place to another. They had lost their jobs, and so they were looking for a new place to start over. And there was a lower cost of living. In Arkansas, the poultry industry is a very important part of the political economy. And so the poultry industry, not just in Arkansas, but regionally, was really hungry for more manpower and more laborers. And so because so many people came, the poultry industry was able to really boom in the 90s and the aughts. And so as another scholar said, Steve Striffler said that the power of chicken cannot be, I forget the exact quote, but it's like the power of chicken cannot be underestimated, right? It was because of the poultry industry in Arkansas, in some places in North Carolina, in Georgia, and Alabama, that there was this dynamic growth of Latinos in the 90s. Beyond Arkansas, other sites like construction work in Atlanta, post-Katrina cleanup in New Orleans, the building of Bank of America in Charlotte, were all
like the actual building
factors. Yeah, the actual building of the Central America, of the Bank of America corporate headquarters. That was a big construction project, not just that building, right? But the in the city. And so they also pulled, right, jalaron workers. And here we can also talk about why Latinos are often cast as like the good workers, the ethical workers. But and so yes, like people want to work, but the other part of that formula is that in something like post cleanup Katrina, a lot of companies didn't want to hire union workers who were white but also black. And so Mexican immigrant labor, Mexican American labor from parts of Texas and California and even Mexico directly were brought in because they were paid less because the companies didn't want to hire union workers, right? So that's the kind of larger political economy of the region.
Yeah, and I think before I have a question on kind of that dynamic of coming in and taking the place of kind of other types of labor that existed. Before that, I'd love if you could speak a little bit to, because there's a dynamic of like migration that is still coming from Mexico, Honduras, or Central America to the South, but there's this also dynamic of like your family and others, people coming from the Southwest, moving towards the Southeast. So what kind of differentiates those between those two things, or how do you interpret that?
So there's a couple of things. So for folks like our families, right, we have roots still in Mexico and Honduras. And so we might tell our relatives, hey, like it's great to live in North Carolina. It's great to live in Arkansas. Vente, yo te ayudo, right? I'll help you and I'll help you make a place here, right? And so there's that kind of social support, social network. This also breaks down along class lines. So in the 90s, when Mexican Americans also moved to the South, they tended to move also for labor. They might have been college educated, right? So they worked managerial positions. In my own work, I did find that a lot of folks who were Mexican American, Puerto Ricanos, New Yorkers served as like that kind of middleman in terms of like being college educated, being a kind of cultural broker. Let's say like you go to a bank, pero nadie habla español, and so they need to hire somebody. So they'll hire the Puerto Riqueño who can't speak English and Spanish, and like, broker the business to the new boom, right? Um, in more contemporary times, because there is a dynamic kind of economic growth for the region as a whole, you might have more highly educated people with masters, working in very many different locations, nonprofits, corporate headquarters in Arkansas. Walmart is headquartered in Arkansas. Tyson is headquartered in Arkansas. Um, JB Hunt is headquartered in Arkansas. And so you have people working for those kinds of companies that are global conglomerates that are moving to the South. Now, whether they stay is a different issue, right? Because if you are growing up in an East Coast town and you move to Springdale, Arkansas to work for Walton headquarters, are you going to be happy in Springdale the whole time? You might move after a couple of years.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting, and I've noticed that especially in like cities, you get that mix of immigrants who are, in the city you can get the immigrants who are doing the construction of the building, but then in those centers you also get those professionals that are coming from that are second, third generation or have well established roots in the Northeast. I've talked to a few business owners or entrepreneurs that have moved their businesses to the South, and it has grown, but they essentially started in other parts and like had their financial base over there, right? And that's a really interesting story, and hopefully we'll be talking about a little bit that in other conversations, that immigrants have kind of this like, their labor is in many ways exploited, but there's instances or moments where they can actually are able to set some roots and establish some like political and then also economic power as well within their communities. And sometimes it's to protect ourselves, right? When there's no services for our community, when there's no services for our own, try to find a way to make some. So going kind of along that topic, the role of labor is super important, right? Not only in bringing in Latinos or immigrants to the South, but also in the way we navigate like this space, right? And so you mentioned the chicken plants, you mentioned some of the construction, you mentioned some of the tension that existed. I had this question of like, because now with hindsight, I'm like, what is the effect of this eager immigrant laborer and many times undocumented who comes in and just takes what is given to him? What is that dynamic, and what does that kind of like displace in terms of the general labor movements that have existed in these areas?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So again, there's a couple of dynamics at play. One is that businesses want to grow, right? And so they need manpower. But business owners rarely want to pay what they should pay their workers, right? Because then they lose profits. And so there are times when, so here's what I tell my students when we get to this unit, right? It's really awesome if you're proud of your dad or your grandpa, right? Porque él pudo, le echó ganas, right? He tried and made this effort. But you also have to understand that, especially if they're undocumented, they're particularly vulnerable.
Yes.
So that work ethic can also be just like hyper productivity. Like, I have to sweep as fast as possible. I have to keep up with the line, because if I lose this job, it'll be harder for me to get another job, right? Yeah. In contradistinction to African Americans who are US citizens and have their own history about labor struggles and are well versed in terms of resistance in labor spaces. And so they're like, I mean, this is something my dad actually told me, right? That one of his coworkers in La Pollera, this Black man was like, hey, like, buddy, like, slow down. Yeah, like, slow down. Why do you, yeah, like, why do you keep going so fast? And my dad's answer, even though he was no longer undocumented, was like, well, this is what business is telling us. This is what management is telling us, that, like, we need to go faster. And his coworker was like, yeah, but you realize if we pluck 80 chickens, an hour, or 100 chickens an hour, we're still getting paid, $7 an hour. So like, why are you like making it so that the rest of us then have to keep up with that? And I think that's often the disconnect in labor spaces,
Yeah.
But there's a reason for that, right? There's a particular kind of vulnerability, especially if folks are undocumented.
I think there's a few. It wasn't, well, North Carolina had a lot of textile, but it wasn't that. Which I remember folks working in factories, but generally there was different types of factories when I was younger that I remember the adults talking about where they worked, and this whole notion of getting paid based on production or parts or whatever you do. It was, as a kid, I was just always intrigued by hearing the stories, but now in hindsight, I'm like, these were terrible circumstances, right? And then like that pattern of like, all right, this is the new baseline, you got to produce to this level, is exploitative in so many ways. And I think it takes so long for someone to develop kind of this consciousness or awareness that like, as a worker, I have some sense of rights or deserve or some sense of protections that I've even kind of navigated with my parents, right? They spent 10, 12 years never stopping to work for almost anything, right? And now my mom she ended up like, I think like 6 months, just decided to work part-time. And then she started feeling free. She started doing things on the weekends with my youngest sister. And like that realization for her that like the reality of or the respect I can have as a worker in my new job can be different from what I suffered more than a decade, is something that really wakes her up to see like, hey, there's certain things that need to be like baseline rights or protections,
right?
Which has been insane for me to just see even within my own family.
Right, to see that growth. Yeah, absolutely. And this also very much matters according to each family's economic necessity, right?
Yes.
Because my mom, for example, has hardly worked in the United States. But the reason she could hardly work is because my dad made enough money. Even though he was a laborer, there was enough money to pay, rent, utility, like everything that we needed, food. And so that was my family situation, right?
Yeah.
But there are other families where both people have to work, right?
Yes.
But I think the tension also lies in when we look at one another as competition, right? So in Arkansas, what happened after a decade or more of migration is that folks were like, okay, que ya no lleguen más personas, que ya no lleguen más mexicanos, right? Because now there aren't as many jobs, like. And so then we start hoarding resources. Now it's like, oh, no le digas que hay un trabajo in the Holiday Inn because I want my sister-in-law to get that job, right? Or feeding the idea that that African Americans are going to take our jobs, or that we're taking African American jobs. This is a framework of scarcity, right?
Yeah.
And this is also what like benefits businesses. When if we took time to really speak with one another, right, to really understand both African American history and labor struggles and civil rights as Latinos and as immigrants, and also African Americans learning about our struggles as immigrants and labor rights and citizenship, that there could be more recognition of like, hey, I think the same system that is screwing you over is screwing me over in different ways. And shouldn't we show up for each other? Shouldn't we support each other's strikes? Shouldn't we like make something better together? And I think, that would be really great to see. I've seen the growth from since I was in Arkansas in 96 through now, that there are more, there's a lot more coalition building between Latinxs and African Americans. And that gives me some real hope for the future.
That's this whole, question of scarcity and what we're fighting over, las migajas, right? The crumbs, is super relevant. How do you think younger generations are kind of interacting with that dynamic?
Yeah.
Or like breaking it down?
Well,
maybe.
I think, I'm obviously biased because I do teach for a living, right? As a college professor, I think it's really important, the kind of courses that are offered in school. Growing up in Arkansas, again, high school, college, I never had a Latina as a teacher in Arkansas. I had Latinas as teachers in California. but in Arkansas, I also didn't have Latinx history, certainly. We barely covered African American history. And so I think education is one route, and not just formal education like college, but also popular
Yes.
education, like this podcast, right? Like just, yeah, like, spreading kind of information about this is our history and these are our struggles. And then breaking down segregation barriers, right? I think, again, what I tell my students is if all of your friends are of your same race or ethnicity, you need to wonder why that's the case.
Hmm.
And you need to start growing your friend base, right? Because we do learn from each other's experiences, right?
Yeah.
Like some of my best friends in high school were children of Vietnamese refugees. We bonded over the fact that our parents were immigrants or refugees to the country, that they were strict in a way that American parents weren't or white parents weren't, that sometimes we felt a little struggle between what our parents expected of us versus what American culture told us we were supposed to be doing, as 16-year-old girls. And that, that we went to each other's houses, that kind of like intimacy and camaraderie is something that you share one-on-one, that then makes you more open to learning about the Vietnamese American experience or to learning about the Mexican immigrant experience, right? So like um really kind of learning from each other, growing with each other, I think is really the potential that the South as a region offers to break down more of the segregation that has structured the United States.
Yeah. And from personal experience and then from the position I do now working at a high school, I definitely see those spaces as important to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The the difficulty is that our schools by neighborhoods or stuff are essentially segregated as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of challenges with that, and educating the younger students, I think it's becomes even more relevant. But the experiences, and that's why I kind of asked you the question of who were your friends when you were in
Mm-hmm.
high school, because to me at least, like not only did I was always aware that like I didn't have other students like me in my classes,
Mm-hmm.
but then I was also aware of like the Latinos friends I had wasn't other Hondureños. It was a Puerto Rican, it was a Mexican, it was a Colombian.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was always interesting too. So I do, yeah, I think, even the sense of being an immigrant in this country, I don't identify much with like my Honduran kind of like identity other than the family I keep there.
Mm-hmm.
But I identify with the notion of like, hey, I have all these different like friends from different nationalities, and their differences to me are interesting, different,
Mm-hmm.
new, and intriguing, right? And I learn
Right.
from them.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, in terms of like how Latinos, coming to this space, which is the South, and really everywhere in the U.S., but the South has a specific history.
Mm-hmm.
Engaging with the history of race and how it plays here, I think is super relevant, right?
Yeah.
So going along with that topic, how do Latinos typically navigate this race, their racial identity in the South?
Yeah. So that's a really complex question. And I think
Yeah.
it goes back to race. Place makes race. So what it means to be even a Latina, again, a Latina in the 90s in Arkansas was different in Fort Smith than it
Hmm.
was in Conway, which is 30 minutes outside of Little Rock. Because in Fort Smith, there were Southeast Asians, and in Conway, the Asian American community was absent.
Okay.
So um, the interactions I had with people were also different. Um, so you take that. There are other places where you might actually have, Black neighbors. You
Hmm.
might be in a Black neighborhood and your family is the only Latinx family on the block, right? That has a particular kind of formation. You will have a particular relationship with your Black neighbors.
Yeah.
Um, versus, let's say you're in another part of the South and you're the only Latino in an overwhelmingly white neighborhood,
Yeah.
right? Then that experience is different. And I think this is, we identities are powerful because, like you said, like we can recognize each other and we can say, oh, your experience is kind of like mine, and isn't it cool, like, you bond over that. But I think it's also really important to understand that the way we are racialized as Latinos is quite different based on place, but also on whether we are white. Because again, Latinos are an ethnicity, not a race, right? So
Mhm.
Latinos can be white, can be Black, can be Asian, can be indigenous, and can be mixed. And so it means something quite different for me as I am to walk through Atlanta than it is for someone else, right? Like Amara La Negra, right? To walk through Atlanta, or to be in Arkansas. And I think that's also part of the challenge that we have as Latinx is that we, yes, should recognize each other's shared experiences, but we also need to recognize that we also have very specific experiences based on our race, based on our gender expression, based on our able-bodiedness that really affects our lives. And so there's not like one answer. I think we're living as Latinos, we're living a multiplicity of experiences.
How would you introduce, or I would say um, attract or welcome young Latinos who are just basically one, still figuring out their place within, like growing up in the South,
Mm-hmm.
but also those older generations, like my parents or your parents,
Mm-hmm.
to explore this Black history that is relevant to not only our own experiences, but how we move forward and how do we strategize together within a place like these various southern states.
Yeah. I think one of the, when we talk about generation, we, that conversation can also be about immigration, right? So my
Hmm.
parents are immigrants. They speak English in a limited way. So a documentary on African American history that is not dubbed to Spanish
Yes.
is not going to impact them the same way. They might sit in front, but they have to read, they have to do these things. And so certainly like having Spanish language media and other indigenous languages as well. Latinos are increasingly also, there's a lot of indigenous migration from Latin America to the United States. So we can't forget about that, right? Having
Yeah.
MAM or Quiche sources, right? So accessibility, right? This becomes an issue of language. It can be an issue of having closed captions. And I think this is the potential for the youth to really kind of do better, do better than my generation has done or
Hmm.
generations before me in really bringing people together and in not closing yourself off to your very limited experience, to recognize that your experience or your family's experience is like one example, but it's not the only one, it's not the only way it could be. And to seek out that information, I think right now we're in a moment where lots of different information is available: podcasts, audiobooks, TikToks, like Instagram, like just little pieces of information. And so we have to be active learners. We can't just expect somebody to pop into our living room to be like, here's your lesson for the day. We
Yeah.
have to be students for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, no, I definitely sympathize with some of that. Um, One of the interesting moments that I've had is that um, fortunately still close to home. I actually didn't
Mhm.
go to school. I was like 15 minutes down the road, but I told my mom that I was going to leave anyways. She was so happy that I was staying nearby. But ultimately, like I did my own thing. But during those times that I got the opportunity to read more, to study more, to meet new people from everywhere, um, I didn't get the opportunity to bring that back as much as I would have
Mhm.
liked to. And the opportunity to stay close to home has given me a lot of opportunities to go back home, sit,
Mhm.
hang out, not have some test or homework assignment,
Right.
and really just talk, right? And I think I've had some
Mhm.
amazing conversations with my stepdad that have been on all different topics that I think gives them some like opportunity to just engage
Mhm.
with topics either about race, about wages, about
Mhm.
healthcare, about elections. They always come up that
Mhm.
maybe I'm consuming all this media, which is essentially in English, and they have some portions of it through either social media or some, like, they don't watch cable news really in Spanish. So like
Yeah.
when I get to sit down with them, like we can get engaged and I can just pay attention to what the
Mhm.
information they have, and what I can share, right? And those nuanced conversations are like almost invaluable because not only does it allow me to connect back with them and be like, hey, I am bringing what I know to you and we can share it together, but it also opens up their space of like, you know, who they have as a source of information.
Right.
They have no one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're talking about is popular education, you know, like you get to go home and talk to your parents, engage with them one-on-one. They'll ask you questions. You can answer them back. Hopefully they will listen to you because sometimes I'm not hating on our elders, but sometimes they think they know everything because they are elders, right? But yeah, I mean, and I think this is also the challenge for, especially for immigrants who are working class and have to work 2-3 jobs, is that
there's no time.
There's no time. How are you supposed to learn? You know, like, and so I think this is, if I could make a call, it would be a call for young people to really like take back, those of you who are studying, whatever it is you're studying in high school or college or something you learn on Instagram, and bring it back to your parents, something that they might not have known. Because I think that's how we just start providing more information to the community.
Yeah, that's I feel like there could be like a reciprocity thing to that as well. Personally, I'm sure you maybe identify with this. I remember all the stories I would hear growing up, right? I remember the story of, you know, them working, you selling cacahuates in Mexico, or my mom selling tortillas in Honduras. So like a lot of the principles or values that I have, you know, kind of extracted from a lot of those stories that they had of them growing up and why certain things were worth it or why family was important. Likewise, I think, you know, there's a reciprocity of like, all right, let me try to bring some of the knowledge or some of the experience that I have gained now back to you, right? Because I think a lot of them, I had this friend whose dad is much older. He's been working for ages now, but it was interesting that she was talking to him about all these movements that were happening in terms of police brutality over this past summer, and her getting the opportunity to sit down and talk to her dad about what he thought about the situation was super eye-opening to her, because, you know, a lot of folks that we were talking in terms of being immigrants who are exploited either at their jobs or who suffer discrimination, internally, they know what it is to experience those situations, right? So when someone like mentions it or says it in this, you know, formalized way, they're like, oh, I know what that means, right? Because I've felt that or I've experienced that. And so like, I think many young folks would be actually impressed by the awareness and the intuition that many older generations have of like how much of this affects them on a day-to-day life. They might not be able to verbalize it, but they've experienced it, and maybe more than some of us.
Yeah, absolutely. They might not have the jargon that some of us have, but they know that experience, right? And I think the other, you know, the other side of that coin is that, you know, as immigrants, you know, especially if you're undocumented, your big obstacle is citizenship, you know, like or just becoming legal, right? So, you know, immigrants often fall back on the story of like, I came with nothing and I made it, right? Like, trabajé duro, le eché ganas, right? I worked hard and I tried. And I think sometimes what that obfuscates is the real structures that exist in the United States that are oppressive to other people, right? So for immigrants who are undocumented, the legality is a big thing. So they might look at African Americans and say, well, what's the issue there? They're US citizens.
Yeah, there's no barriers, there's no reason, no excuse.
Exactly. But they don't have that understanding of the way that anti-Black racism works in the United States, right? And they also use their own trajectory, right? Here you are, here I am, like we are college educated, we're professionals. I'm sure your family is as proud as my family is of me. And so they're like, we made it, you know, like it's true what they say about the United States. And then that again, that ignore, they're unaware because they've never had to deal with anti-Blackness of the way that manifests in the United States, right? And so they can also kind of perpetuate this idea of like, ganas lo puede todo, just like trying is enough when we know that's not the case. So I think that's the other real powerful thing that young people can bring to their families is like knowing much more about like this is what the experience is like in the United States as a young person. And this is what I'm telling you my friends are telling me or what I see in our daily lives. Because oftentimes immigrants work so much, their life is as laborers, not as very many other things that have to do with like the larger country and community.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things, and almost coming back to this idea that you had spoken about with identifying as Chicano or Chicano or the history, is that you mentioned in one of the pieces this idea that Chicana and having this connection to citizenship, but then also seeing or realizing that a lot of this undocumented youth were some of the movement leaders and the minds that were pushing us forward in a more progressive position, and how they deserve to at least have the option of adopting kind of that that identity or that history, right, of struggle, of progress, of civic engagement that maybe not everybody has. So I think that touches a little bit to how we go forward with even those who are just immigrants, right, and may not identify with the specific term of Mexican born in the US, but that may identify with the way that the struggle play out, the way that it continues to play out.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things I forgot to say that I think is can be quite powerful about Chicano identity is that you're claiming here. You're claiming this place. You're saying, I belong here. Whether you're an immigrant or second generation American or third or fifth, you're saying I belong here. This is also my place. And I think that is really powerful because I think sometimes we shrink ourselves. We feel like maybe, we don't necessarily belong here. And of course, this should be always within a larger framework of the fact that we are on indigenous land, that the United States is a settler colonial society. But Chicano identity can offer we also belong here. You are not going to make us feel smaller, loud and proud, as you say. I think that's the real possibility too.
That's awesome. And that's a great place to kind of start our closing. Let me ask you maybe real quick, what do you think is a power or un poder that Southern Latinos have?
Yeah, I mean, I think the power is that of possibility. The South gets talked about as if it's backward and backwater and slow, but the South has also been home to some very radical movements. Organizing, labor, Latinos included, right? If any of you haven't read, you should read The Maya of Morganton. It was one of the first books written on Latinos in the South, and it's about an indigenous community that organized for labor rights in North Carolina. And so, the power to really kind of push the rest of the nation forward, because the South is less populated than a place like the Southwest, California and Texas. You can build alliances, you can break down barriers, you can really lead a movement that can go national, right? We saw that in Georgia with Black voters. Latinx and Asian voters were also important in the most recent elections. And I think there's a real possibility for unsettling things in a really productive way. By using the power of place, by recognizing that as a region, y'all or we, have a lot to offer.
What is, real quick, what is Southern Latinx Cultura?
Oh man, that's so many things, with the second project I'm working on, I've talked to a handful of Latinx Southerners who were either deported or coerced returned. So I've been thinking about this a lot. Because we ended up talking about food a lot. It's soul food, fried chicken, one of the leaders in Mexico, an organizer, Maggie Loredo of Otros Dreams and Acción,
Mhm.
her favorite food is French fries con mole. So
Oh.
not necessarily Southern specific, right? But she grew up in Georgia, she grew up in
Okay.
Dalton. And so like that combination, right? And iced tea and like it it can be anywhere from food to also again this possibility of organizing, uncover your radical roots,
Mhm.
uncover the radical roots of the South, and don't let people diminish you as a Southerner, as a Latinx Southerner. Like, claim who you are, say it loud and proud, and like use that as like an engine to really move the rest of us forward.
That's great. French fries con mole is a great way to complicate any conversation about identity
Absolutely.
or culture. That's great. And then just last question to finalize, what is something that for you represents this concept that we're trying to build out of Nuestro South?
I think it's, I think sharing is caring. I think
Mhm.
what I mean by that is we shouldn't be competitive with one another, whether we're immigrants, undocumented, TPS, DACA, citizens, um, whether we're talking about other groups like Asian Americans and African Americans or African immigrants who are also a growing community. Um, we need to recognize that we should learn from each other's struggles and understand how we can band together. I think that's the real power. The scariest thing for systems and power is coalition building. When
Mhm.
we really see each other's humanity, when we really see the specificity of like your experience, as a young man, my experience as a young woman, and other people's experiences, and say, like, I see you, I hear you, and like let's walk together, to like let's walk together to alter where we are and where we live to make it that much better for everyone.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor Perla Guerrero. This was an amazing conversation and really introduction into so many other topics that we could go on deeper. But we hope that those listening can keep on engaging with some of the conversations we'll have forward, and can check out some of your work as well, which will be included in the description of wherever we're sharing this. Thank you so much again, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Axel. It was my pleasure to join you.
Take care.